we have my dear friend Arunava Sinha and Alison James. Arunava Sinha translates classic, modern, and contemporary Bengali fiction, non-fiction, and poetry from across the subcontinent, from India and Bangladesh mainly, into English. 51, and I know this is a steadily, very fast-growing number, so it might be dated, it might actually be 55 or something, but 51 of his collections have been published so far. And with him in conversation, we have Alison James from the University of Chicago. She's a professor of French in the Department of Romance Languages. And Alison, remind me, you're also the director of the Romantic Languages? Yes. At the University of Chicago, and Alison's research and teaching interests include post-war experimental writing, theories and representations of everyday life, and documentary literature. Please welcome Arunava Sinha and Alison James.
So, Arunava, it's very nice to be here with you to talk about translation and translation of poetry specifically. So as Savik just said, you've translated a lot of fiction, non-fiction, and poetry, but I'd like to begin by inviting you to read from some of your poetry translations, and then after that we'll have a conversation, and then also be time for questions from the audience at the end. But let me turn things over to you to start.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me here. I thought maybe I might read a few poems from an anthology that I put together of, it's called Modern Bengali Poetry in Translation. So it really starts inevitably, like everything, well, many things in Bengali literature, with Rabindranath Tagore, and comes up to fairly modern times. So I'll just pick a few. Tagore is mostly known for his lyrical poetry and the songs that he wrote as far as poetry is concerned. But he also later on in his life did some fairly modern writing where poetry was concerned. And while it is completely beyond me to translate his lyrical poetry, I had a go at some of the more modern poems of his. So this one's called An Unexpected Meeting, Hotat Dekha. We met suddenly on a train. I hadn't thought it possible. I'd seen her over and over in a red sari, crimson like a dahlia. Today she was in black silk. It covered her head in a cowl, cupped her face, lustrous and fair like a lily. She seemed to have enveloped herself in a deep, dark distance, the distance to the edge of the mustard fields, to the blue-grey of the shalwood. My senses came to a sudden stop. I knew her once. Now she wore a stranger's solemnity. Throwing aside her newspaper, she greeted me suddenly. Social mores could now be followed. We began to converse. How are you? How is everyone? Etc. She continued to gaze out of the window, as though she had overcome the contagion of intimacy. She answered in monosyllables. Some she didn't even respond to. Conveyed with an impatient wave, why talk of all this? Silence is so much better. I was on another bench with her companions. After a while, she beckoned with her finger. Such boldness, I thought. I sat down on the same bench. Under the sound of the train, she said softly, please don't mind. Where's the time to waste time? I have to get off at the next station. You're going further. We'll never meet again. So I want your answer to the question that hasn't been answered all this time. You'll tell the truth, won't you? I will, I said. Still gazing at the sky outside, she asked, are those days of ours that are gone, gone forever? Is nothing of them left? I was silent for a while. Then I said, all the stars of the night remain under the glare of the day. I felt doubtful. Had I made it all up? Never mind, go sit over there now. Everyone got off at the next station. I journeyed alone. I'm going to skip on ahead to the poet who was possibly the best known in Bengal after Rabindranath Tagore, that's Jivanananda Das, whose own life story was so tragic that it kind of added to his luster as a poet of the melancholy. This one is called If We Were. If I were a wild swan and you one too, by the river on a horizon near the rice field, within slender shafts in a secluded nest, then on the spring night, gazing at the moonrise behind the casuarina rose, leaving the smell of the water on the lowland behind, we'd let ourselves float over the silver harvest in the sky, my feathers in your wings, the pulse of your blood in mine, millions of stars like golden cornflower in the indigo sky, in the shaggy green shirish forest, like an egg of gold, the spring moon, perhaps a gunshot. Our oblique momentum in our wings, the euphoria of pistons in our throats, the song of the north wind, perhaps a gunshot again. Silence for us, peace for us. No more of the fragmented death of our life, no splintered, thwarted wishes and darkness. If I were a wild swan and you one too, by the river on a horizon near the rice field. I'll go on to a poet named Amiya Chakravarti, who wrote in, much of his poetry was actually influenced by the poetry he'd read in English. And here's a very unusual one for Bengali poetry. It's called On the Island of Santa Maria. Anthony lies beneath the moist green church field. Villager 1, do you have some comfort at last? Does the memorial stone with your name above feel heavy? Can you still hear the whispering willow deep underneath? Anthony, they say in the depths you have found your heavenly home. Villager 2, if you walked up here, you'd find your vision unbound, the old village road, the river you know in the south, where home was by bluish waves in the cornfield. If you took a bus to the market, ready to travel afar, where Fernandez, your neighbor, sells Coca-Cola. Widowed sister, Anthony, we cannot hear what you say anymore. Still I wish for your laughing banter, your gentle face, shy and distant, gazing in rapt attention at your work. You look for something, drawing your glasses to yourself as before. Somewhere though, the exchanges have stopped. Foreigner, passerby, friend. Leaving paltry physical senses to the 5 elements you seek, I think, the deeper touch of soul. Here the world swells, placing you in burial and prayers on the far side of grief and tears. Evening chants rise quivering in the air. Do you hear, Anthony, Anthony, in the solemn notes of bells? Friend's wife, your child left first. You lie by her side. Beneath your gravestone, the third empty place is Margarita's. She's here every day, bowing to accept the weight of remembrance of husband and child. Who knows what hope puts a shimmering glow of silent prayer on her face. The church bell peals incessantly. Chorus, we have not forgotten, Anthony, even if we leave the church for home now, we will leave for our final home too, only some earlier and some later. Okay, I'll jump further ahead to Buddhadev Bose, who was, of course, the most versatile Bengali writer since Tagore. We're still under Tagore's shadow here. This one's called Bloomington, Indiana. How quiet this Sunday morning is. The streets deserted, the houses asleep behind curtains, rows of unemployed cars. In this country, no one gets out of bed before 1 o'clock on Sundays. The roads lie like canvases with the silence of the trees on either side. But when I went out, I heard a tring-tring sound behind me. Tring, 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 a few minutes gap, and then again. Wounding the tender body of the wind, the sound rose, piercing, voluble, ardent. I walked along, and following me, the sound seemed unending. What message was the telephone ringing with? In whose house? For which hero? Which friend? Which lover? Was it someone in distress waiting on the other side? Had someone's loneliness proved unbearable? Had death visited someone? Or was it some mute sorrow, some unspoken grief that finally wanted to be heard, like a bugle in the incessant ringing of the telephone bell? But could no one beside me hear it? Was I the only one awake on the street? Citizens, wake up! Hero, friend, lover, hold out your arms. Awaken, heart, awaken, agony, awaken, consciousness. Listen to the cries. Save me, save me. They are for you, only for you, this announcement. These are those same tears that keep flowing across the world like an unceasing current in a secret melody, They materialize for you today, this moment, spreading out in one wave after another. Someone wants you. You are needed. You, the fortunate one. I don't know when the sound stopped. Don't know whether someone sank into despair. All I know is that the one who calls out is vulnerable. The one who expects is helpless. For sometimes the telephone rings in numbed rooms, some letters never reach, and the language of what must be said is inaccessible. Meanwhile, the June sky was bright, the wind once again calm and invigorating. The leaves rose and fell like breath, and the houses were stilled as usual behind curtains of sleep. Moving on, here's a poem by a poet who wrote of the revolution, Dinesh Das. He wrote of the revolution that wasn't, but many poets, at least for them, it lived on. Hone that sickle, my friend. Bayonets might be pointed. Hone that sickle, my friend. Shells and bombs may pack a punch. Is the sickle sharp, my friend? Did the young crescent moon make you fall in love? It's not the century of the moon. That sickle is the moon above. Those who had filled the world with cannons and with lead have been ground to dust today by cannon fire instead. So this world of leaden dust melts in your blood sea of red, turning into clay and earth. The age of land lies ahead. Gathering on the horizon, there's the earth, my friend. Is your sickle sharpened? The sickle of land, my friend. And here's another leftist poet, Subhash Mukhopadhyay, and this one's called a May Day poem. This is no time to play with flowers, my love. We are face to face with destruction. Blue wine dreams are gone from our eyes, and skins baked by a searing sun. Listen to the chimney's bugle siren. The hammer and sickle are singing. We die every moment, but still we live, and we love the millions who are living. Give all obstacles the dowry of passion. Let your nails and teeth vow to kill. Aroused rhythms will snap all chains. Bright days lie beyond the hill. The weeping of the downtrodden century brings shame with every single breath. Put on the armor for battle now. No more waiting like cards for death. This is no time to play with flowers, my love. The news of destruction is here. What if we lose our way in the storm? To young souls, the road will be clear. I want to go to a poem by Shankha Ghosh, one of his best-known poems. It's called Advertisements Hide My Face. All alone I wait for you. In the lane I find my place. I think of giving you a glimpse, but advertisements hide my face. I think I'll signal with my eyes a simple truth or maybe two. They glitter in the gaudiness of advertisements colored blue. It's hard to tell how one man sees the other one, with love or scorn. But oh, my exaggerations, but oh, the land where I was born. Once my eyes were locked with yours, but now my glances have been sold. The neon creates commodities of private stories never told. All the things I meant to say are in that lane now, languishing, but my mask, so exhausted, dangles from the advertising. A very short poem of his which I love, so I'm just going to read this one. It's called Drunk. Make him a little more drunk. How else will he bear this world easily? He's still young, Lord. Age him now, then. How else will this world bear him easily? Shakti Chattopadhyay, who was famous as much for the kind of life he led as for the poetry that he wrote, but the poetry was quite fantastic, of course. There's a slightly long one. It's called Postman in the Autumnal Forest. I have seen postmen wandering in the autumnal forest, their yellow sacks filled with grass like swollen sheep bellies. So many letters new and old they had found, those postmen in the autumnal forest. I have seen them pecking away incessantly like a solitary crane at a fish, so impossibly, mysteriously, warily absorbed. They're not like those postmen of ours, from whose hands our constant, indulgent love letters are lost all the time. We are moving away from one another continuously, distancing ourselves out of greed for letters. We are getting many letters from far away. We are getting away from you at once to hand over letters loaded with love to the postman. And so we are moving away from the kind of people we are ourselves. And so we are about to express our foolish weaknesses and motives, everything. We can no longer see ourselves in the mirror. We keep floating in the unpopulated evening veranda And so we are taking off our clothes to be swept away alone in the moonlight. For a long time, we have not embraced one another. For a long time, we have not savored human kisses. For a long time, we have not heard people sing. For a long time, we have not seen babbling children. We are drifting towards a forest even more ancient than the forest, where the mark of eternal leaves is fused in stone jaws. We are floating away to a land of such unearthly connections. I have seen postmen wandering in the autumnal forest, their yellow sacks filled with grass like swollen sheep bellies. So many letters, new and old, they had found, those postmen in the autumnal forest. The distance between letters has only grown. I have never seen the distance between trees grow.
But
Yeah.
thank you for this journey through modern Bengali poetry. I know we're here to talk about translation, but I'm interested in the gesture of anthologizing as well. So this is an exercise I sometimes give my students, to come up with compile mini anthologies of poetry, and it's actually quite a difficult exercise. So I'm curious about the kind of story you feel you're telling about modern Bengali poetry when you make this kind of selection. Are you in some ways telling a familiar story? You talked about being under the shadow of Tagore, and are you repeating that kind of story? Are you pushing back against that story? Are you trying to pick representative voices or to focus on variety? So how do you go about making that kind of selection?
Okay, so I'm going to disappoint you.
Okay.
I'm not a scholar. I have no scholarly pretensions. I don't even claim to be extremely well read where Bengali poetry is concerned. So, for the purpose of this anthology, which was commissioned by a publisher in Wales, I just went first with a selection of poets. And there the idea was to represent the entire period, starting with Tagore, because really there was poetry before him, of course. Michael Madhusudhan Datta wrote poetry. But I just fairly arbitrarily defined modern as beginning with some of the poetry that Tagore wrote in terms of sensibilities and perhaps thinking. And came as close to the time as possible in which the book was actually going to be published. And then picked the poets whom I had read. And out of their works, I picked the poems for translation that, one, appealed to me. B, at the back of my mind, I had the thought that there should be some stories, that the poems also should perhaps tell stories. Not all poetry does or needs to. And third, poems that I thought I could translate. And this is perhaps the most important thing, because you read 10 poems and you love them all, and maybe you can only translate one of them. The others are meant for other translators. So it was this extremely personalized and subjective basis on which I picked. But I do believe that if you cast your net wide enough, then like it or not, you are going to end up capturing a zeitgeist. Whatever filter you apply does not matter. If you're going to one poet, maybe, then your personal choice might make a big difference. But if you're going across about 100 years of poetry and you're picking, in this case, over 50 poets, then you do end up giving a sense of what was written in poetry in that period. So that was essentially what it was. As for pushing back against, I think the poets themselves did enough of that. Those who were so much under the shadow of Tagore very consciously made sure to write in a way that would mark them as being significantly different or significantly moving in an opposite direction. So that took care of itself. And yet, as Buddhadev Bose himself said that, he was considered a critic of Tagore, and yet he himself said that and when Tagore was alive, and Tagore who was a very egoistic person, which is not surprising perhaps, expressed his disappointment at the fact that Bose was antagonistic about his work. But then Buddhadev Bose wrote somewhere saying, does he not know that I cannot pass a single day without him? So in a sense, this centripetal and centrifugal force was, I think, at work, even as someone who doesn't read poetry critically, but only as an interested reader. Even there, you can see both the attraction and the repulsion, as it were, I think. So you can't get away from it. And really, it perhaps is the only language in the world where a poet's works continue to be read, heard, sung, and repeated with so much verve and enthusiasm. It's 80 years after his death. He died in 41, and over 150 years after his birth. So I guess you could, in a sense, call it Tagore's children.
Okay.
Any anthology of Bengali poetry will inevitably be in some way Tagore's family tree.
You called it Desire for Fire. Does that come from one of the poems?
That comes from
One
one
of
of
the
the
poems.
poems. Yes. That comes from a poem by Nabarun Bhattacharya, who has a very sort of iconic, now famous first line, which is, "This valley of death is not my country, and not my land." And that's a line that's actually been applied to various realities in India over history, and you can use it right now as well. "Ei mrityu pottaka amar desh na." That's how the first line goes.
Thank you. No, that wasn't a disappointing answer at all. I think the anthologies always end up being personal in this way. It's this and I like what you're saying about the way the poems in some ways do the work themselves, of sort of telling the story of telling the story of poetry, or telling the talking about the history of poetry. So coming back to the question of translation, so you translate a lot of fiction as well. So I'm curious about the experience of translating poetry and how it differs. Do you find it more difficult? You talked about finding poems you thought you couldn't translate when you were putting together the anthology. What is it like to translate poetry as opposed to translating prose, and just what are the specific challenges you face?
Yeah. Well, I have read a lot of poetry which has been translated by poets. And the interesting thing there is that they're great poetry. The translations are fantastic poetry. Even many of the poets I've translated were themselves translators. Buddha Bose, for example, Vishnu, there are many others. But interestingly, as poets, they wrote poetry first, I think, and they were, let's say, inspired by the works that they were translating. Now, I could not afford to take such, I don't want to use the word liberties, but let's say I could not afford to be so confident as to say that I will write poems inspired by the poems I'm translating. So that, in a sense, made things difficult, because I do not have the skills that a poet has. So I'm led, as in prose, by the text itself. In poetry, of course, the text is doing so much more perhaps than prose, in the sense that it is much more charged with meaning, as Ezra Pound said. And to me, poetry is the classic example of minimalism, in the sense that I see minimalism as get everything out of what you have. It's not about how few things you have, but given what you have, get everything out of it. Do not attempt to bring anything else into it. So that applies to all translation, but for poetry, it's doubly applicable, because if the poet has used 10 lines, then I believe that my translation should be 10 lines. And sometimes between languages which are structured very differently, as Bangla and English are, that can be a huge challenge. Because Bangla, for example, very often will do away with, many Indian languages will do away with verbs, will do away with subjects, because sometimes the verb ending will determine whether it's the first person or second person or third person. You don't need I, you, they, etc. Bangla has this added beauty of pronouns being not gendered. So sometimes you have to end up making a choice. So Tagore played this beautifully, and you could never quite tell what was going on. And it was only much later that they became an acceptable word, I think, which I think in retrospect I should have used a lot more than he and she in many cases. I've seen some translators very cleverly turn it into the second person, make it you.
I see.
So that you're then left, you're still ambiguous on gender, which is a great solution, I think. Yeah. So these are, of course, challenges. Perhaps the toughest challenge is the sound and the music, because Bangla also, like many Indian languages, also uses something like Gerard Manley Hopkins' sprung rhythm, in the sense that there's a lot of tuck 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 thing. If you hear a line being spoken out, you'll get that sense of climbing steps, or climbing up steps, climbing down steps. English is a much more rolling cadence, right? So in order to you can't very often turn English into that step, that breaking thing. So that becomes interesting. And like, for example, that line, advertisements hide my face. The Bangla is muk dheke jaye big gapone. You can see muk dheke jaye big gapone. So you have this almost, like you're riding a horse. That's kind of thing, right? And it's very hard to do that in English, because if you have so many hard syllables one after the other, you're not going to be able to speak it.
you end up trying to find equivalents as models? I mean, you talked about Hopkins. Do you find
Yeah.
like poets who have something similar, and then you try to kind of model your English on? Or?
Well, in theory,
Yeah.
then I go and read Hopkins and I say, oh my God, I
That
can't
kind
do this. Let's not even try. Yeah. So, but the other thing about poetry is that entire lines come into mind. And you're not sort of going word by word, as it were. You're mulling over a line, and the entire line pops up in your head, sometimes unbidden. So there's a different process at work there. I'm not saying it's mystical at all. I'm just saying that it's not assembled in the same way as prose is assembled.
Yes.
So, and then a line comes, and then you think, is this poetry or is this not poetry? So sometimes it works that way. At other times, you are actually doing an engineering job. You're taking a line, you're translating it, and then you're asking yourself the same question. Yes, it says the same thing, but is it poetry? And then line by line you go, and then you listen most of it.
So the unit of translation is the line. You're sort of working at that scale all the time. That's interesting. Yeah. So I wonder if you could say something about audience, or how you think about the audience for your translations, because it struck me. I was reading your translation of Bhaskar Chakravarti and Things That Happen in Other Poems, and this is poetry that's very located, right? It's very much in Kolkata, in various places in West Bengal, and so there are references to streets, a lot of very specific cultural references that you end up explaining in endnotes to each poem. So does this tend to be an issue when you're translating? You have to figure out how much to explain to the reader, and do you worry about over-explaining?
What was your response when you read the poems? To the local elements.
To the local elements. I like the endnotes. I'm glad they weren't footnotes, because I don't like to be sometimes distracted when I'm reading. So they weren't on the same page. So I thought that the approach worked well. But yes, it was interesting, because it's poetry that's at once very concrete in these local elements, and then also, also very, very abstract. It's very focused on kind of interiority as well, and so so I thought it was helpful to have those kinds of explanations. But I always kind of worry about this. I wonder about this when I'm translating. How much do you have to kind of explain to a reader? How much can you assume?
So personally, I'm not a fan of explanations. In this case, the editor and I talked it over, and the editor said, put them in, because there are people who will be curious. And I resisted initially, because my argument is that if you cannot expect a reader from a different part, from a different history and a different geography, to read the poem the same way as a person who shares a history and a geography and a culture will. So why are we even trying? Instead of trying to force feed this whole thing, you must understand the context. The reader won't, and that's the whole point. If the poetry is any good in terms of its universality, then it will still be good, even if the reader doesn't have the context. And I don't think you can shove it down their throat. In any case, there's no guarantee that your reader today has the context for a poem that was written 30, 40, 50 years ago, even if it happens to be in a language that they know. I think with poetry, the whole point of it is that each reader will get their own thing out of it. And if like a film, we are trying to make everybody see the same thing, then the poem will have failed, and the translation too will have failed. The translation must, like the poem itself, must open up the possibility for each reader internalizing it their own way and getting something out of it. So I think local references, in a sense, tell the reader, when they don't know what they are, that, okay, there's specificities here. I don't know what those specificities are, but let's see what it does to me as a result. If it makes them pause, that's one thing. If it makes them trip, then perhaps it's not such a good idea. But then again, I remembered that we in India, because we were colonized, we've read all our literature. Many of us have read our literature to begin with in the English language, and not just literature written written originally in English, but translated into English as well. So we read Russian literature and French literature and so on. And the words, names, a lot of things were unpronounceable, leave alone even knowing what they were referring to. We had no problem. We soldiered on and we read them. And we were actually, I'm always reminded of this sequence, which I'm slight tangent here. There's a little scene in Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, where there's one of the people who are wooing the heroine, Lata, is speaking very knowledgeably of the plays currently on the London stage. This is the 1950s, I think, or 60s. And then somebody turns to him and says, so how many times have you been to London? And he meant that as a genuine question. He wasn't being sarcastic. And he kind of looked shifty and he said, actually, I haven't. So, the familiarity with which we in India could talk about things in the West, I think kind of reminded me that it's fine. I mean, we don't have to go out of our way to make readers. And it's not about the West versus the East. But the fact is that the reader can come to it from their position, however informed or uninformed they are, it doesn't matter. Great literature is going to be great literature, and let the work speak for itself. And let the work be tested for itself.
Yes, so I've never been to Kolkata, but I can read the poems and I know we're in a city and it's this kind of city.
Yeah.
But I think so. No, I think it's more helpful maybe for things like literary references that you might miss. But
Yeah, they're crucial. Yeah.
It's a crucial thing. But for place names, you can figure out that there's just a kind of
Yeah.
specificity that's being signaled as well. So no, I agree with you.
I mean, sometimes, of course, you will have specificities where the place name is a shorthand for something else. Then it becomes a bit tricky, because without that something else, then the poem doesn't work. So then it can get interesting.
So you also teach translation. You taught translation workshops in many places and countries as well. So I wonder how you go about doing that. Are there specific exercises you have students do? Are there things you find that students bring to the table that you haven't thought about as well?
All the time. They do. And it's mainly their questions that bring up things that I hadn't thought about. But the idea of teaching translation is not to treat it like mathematics, where you say there is one right answer and this is how you solve it. But really, it's about two things. One is to love translating, because unless you love it, you're not going to do it on a sustained basis. And the other, or you can't teach someone how to love, but you can show them what are the things about it that you can love, and then leave it to them. The other important thing is that you teach a translator how to judge their own work, because eventually the value of what they're doing lies in their own ethical relationship with the text. It is not for someone else to come in and say, this is right, this is wrong. It's not a crossword puzzle. But how do you take the decisions that make the most sense to you? Because at every point, when you're taking one text into another, you're always faced with a choice. What words to use, what to foreground, how many of the allusions to keep. Vivek Debra was talking earlier about the fact that, and I was very interested in his answer. He said that I was more concerned with fidelity to the meaning and sense of the word than to the readability of the text. And I was thinking in my head, that's a very sharp, distinct choice, because although I haven't read the original in Sanskrit, but I'm told by those who have that it is extremely readable. So now the question is, if by purging or taking or reducing the readability of a text in order to ensure that every single word and meaning and so on is maintained, you are clearly foregrounding one at the expense of the other. So these are choices that a translator needs to make knowingly. So teaching is a lot about getting translators to figure out what questions to ask themselves and making sure that they answer them, and then that they have a reasonable amount of consistency. Even that is not crucial. You can actually make two different kinds of choices in the same text. There's nothing to say that you'll always do it one way. But even then, they should be aware of the fact that, fine, I did it this way here and I'm doing it this way here. I think that is essential, because it informs your practice in a way that you get better at it. So as you go on and translate more, you are beginning to make these choices organically rather than having to think them through mechanically. So to me, this is what teaching translation is about. It is about getting translators to think and make all the choices for themselves. It is not about saying you did this right or you did that wrong, or I can give you a better option to this word or that phrase. No, that's not the idea.
I find it's very hard to get students out of that mindset, actually, the good translation versus a bad translation.
Yeah.
Just pointing out that there are choices you make, there are strategies you can adopt, and there's not a right answer to this. But
it's very helpful actually to show them different versions, different translations of the same text. And then I ask them, which one do you like better? And then some of them say, I like this, others say that. So I said, there you are then, they're all good.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. So are you working on any translation projects at the moment? I imagine you are because you translate a lot.
Yeah. No, there's always works in the pipeline. Yes. Right now, well, I'm inevitably working on three things at a time because there's one book with a publisher somewhere and it's coming back for edits and so on. So that's the one that's closest to publishing. So there the interventions are of a different kind. There's one where I'm deeply into translating and I'm right in the middle of it. So right now that's a set of short stories by a writer from Bangladesh who she lives in Denmark. So I'm working on her text. And there's one more text which you will take on next. And I do this self-indulgent thing of spending a little time on it, maybe 15 minutes every day, just to prepare myself for the next text, as it was, so that when I hit it, I will not start cold. So that's a novel, which is a very strange novel, which was set in the late 19th century Calcutta, where a man who is dying is suddenly visited by two strange creatures, and it seems that there's a lot of references to it, which I, for the life of me, cannot catch, to the literary theory of the carnival by the Russian. Who's the Russian? Yes, there you. I don't even remember his name, but yeah. So I'm looking forward to figuring that out.
Thank you, Arunava. That was it was so great to hear that kind of the selections from the anthology and a kind of little mini history of modern Bengali poetry. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like contemporary Bengali poetry and maybe from the other kind of perspective, not Bengali poets being translated into English, but what kinds of poetry are being translated into Bangla for, yeah.
Yeah, well, again, I can't claim to be up to date on my reading of contemporary Bangla poetry, but the good thing is that there is a lot of poetry being translated into Bangla. I fear, sadly, sometimes without official permission or taking copyright permission, but there it is. There's a lot of focus on the works of modern European and Latin American poets, which is very interesting. So it's no longer just poets who wrote in English who are being translated, but a number of them whose works are now people are reading in Bangla, which I think is fantastic, because now you have a whole new readership for a poetry that originated in a completely different part of the world and was not mediated through English and therefore was inaccessible. I mean, there are English translations, of course, but those are not easily available in India. So it's great that poets like Tadeusz Roszewicz and a lot of haikus, not modern, of course, yeah. Maybe because they're easier to translate, I don't know, or they feel easier to translate. A lot of that, and of course, the Latin American poets have always been like I think football and poetry go together when it comes to a love for Latin America among Bengali-speaking people. So if you're obsessed with Brazil and Argentina, then you'll want to know what's the poetry being written in that part of the world. So Neruda has, of course, always been read in Bangla for a very long time and has been seen on walls as graffiti, especially university and college walls, often used for come and see the blood on the streets. For example, that line has been used repeatedly by student movements to protest against state-sponsored violence. There have been translations of poets like Mark Strand and Joy Harjo. Is that how you pronounce her name? Yeah, so I think people, thanks to the internet, people are now reading a lot more of poetry from around the world, and enthusiastic translators are picking them up. And not all of it is in form of books either. The translations just go directly onto the net. So a lot of reading is happening in that manner, which I think is fantastic, really. And that's the great thing about poetry, right? You don't have to wait for a book now anymore. Like in all the poetry translation exercise I sat in my class, the source is inevitably the internet. The poems all come of well-known poets, but their works are on the internet, particularly Poetry Foundation, which is so good. So poetry, I make my students translate into their own languages, by the way, not into English.
you end up working closely with poets when you're translating contemporary poetry, or not really?
No, the three poets whose works I have done, I mean, I've done substantial books out of their works, were all dead by the time I took up their work. And for this, a few, but not too many. I mean, they were all. I sent the translations to them, but there weren't too many comments.
Yeah, some poets like to be hands off about.
Yeah, I respect that, because sometimes a poet or a writer will say, if you want me to get into it, then I will really get into it. So it's better. It's your work. Leave it there. So fair. That's fair. And some couple of them have told me I'd rather write a new poem than go and start working on translations of my own poems. I just realized that I read poems only by men. Will you allow me to read at least one poem by? Her name is Ketaki Kushari Dyson. She lives in the UK. And in fact, she told me, I was very keen on translating her novel and entire collection. And she said, I will make your life so miserable that I suggest you wait till I'm dead. Okay, this one's called Fallen Leaves. There have been no letters from me, such is your complaint. I'm compelled to tell you that if my disobedient letters were once to start falling on your lap like the uncontrollable leaves of autumn, you wouldn't be able to cope with them, recipient. Overflowing your lap into files, from files into drawers, from drawers into the trunk. Finally pushing open the lid, they would emerge in a procession across the desk, the bed, the floor, the doorstep, the top of the cupboard, the window ledge. You would go mad. The liberated leaves would not be contained even in your empty room. Unannounced one night, without sending word, I will reach your neighborhood. Peeping through the window, I will see, suspended over the jumble of my letters smothering your room, the white moon, laughing. Your door is wide open. Turned insane by the torrent of shed leaves, you have gone out without locking your room. I will see my letters lying there, naked, helpless, weeping. Anyone can pick them up and read them and burst out laughing as they read in competition with the moon itself.
Let me thank you for conversation. We covered a lot of ground, I think, from teaching, apologizing to translating. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thanks for the conversation.